So now that we understand the basic conventions inside Unity, we want to get started with our first project, the Gravity Lab. Now, in order to start this first project, what we'll do is inside Unity, we'll choose File, New Project. And what we get is the project wizard pops up inside Unity, and there's a couple of important decisions that we need to make on the front end. For this project, I'm going to set the project location as the desktop, so I can have a project folder sitting here on the desktop. Once I make progress on this project, we'll move that to a more appropriate location, but I do want to save it to the desktop to demonstrate what happens and how Unity manages that project creation process. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll hit set and I'll change the location because the default location is inside one of my user folders, and I do want to save this to the desktop. So where it says where, instead of documents, I'm going to change this to desktop. And of course, if you're looking through this interface, if you click on this little triangle here, it'll reveal the column view. So if you feel more comfortable navigating that way, that works as well, but I'm just going to choose the desktop. For the save as, in this field, I want to create the name that I want my project folder to be. And in this case, I will call it Gravity Lab. So I'm telling Unity to create a Gravity Lab project on the desktop. I'll hit save. The next decision that I need to make is what kind of packages do I want to include. Now Unity comes with a lot of packages so we can get up and running really quickly, and these are just assets and scripts and effects that we might want to use to get our projects going. And it's okay if we don't select any of these at this point, we can always import them later. But I know that I want to probably play around with a little bit of particles, definitely some physics materials. I may want to use scripts and some skyboxes as well. If there's anything else in this list that I decide that I want to use, I can always import those later. So I have a few packages selected. The next step in the process is simply to create the project. Now when I hit the create project, I just want to point out that my desktop, there's going to be a folder that pops up called Gravity Lab. So I'll hit create project. It's asking me if I want to save any of the changes that I may have inadvertently made to Angry Bots. I'll say don't save. And Unity will shut down or close temporarily, and you can see that it created that Gravity Lab project folder. So Unity goes through the process of decompressing the packages that I chose to use in just a moment. Unity will pop back up with an empty project. So what we have here is we have an empty scene view. It only contains a main camera, and I can tell that by two ways. There's a camera icon inside the scene, and if I look over here in the hierarchy, I can see that there's the main camera listed here. Now if I look inside my project folder or my project tab, I can see that I'm looking inside the assets folder. And inside the assets folder, we have a standard assets folder. And if we look inside standard assets, you can see we have particles, physics materials, scripts, and skyboxes. Those are the packages or the components that I chose to select when I created the project. Now in the event that I missed selecting any of these, or I decide later that, oh, there was a package that I wanted to utilize, I can always go to the asset drop-down menu and choose to import package, and I have the list of all of those packages right here. Okay, but for now I can get started and I can use just what I have here. So in this project we want to experiment with the basic game objects inside Unity. We'll configure some of the parameters and modify its components and add components to some basic game objects. And so the way that we generate game objects inside Unity is by going to the game object drop-down menu and choosing to create other. Now in this list you'll see lots of different things. We can create particle systems and cameras and some GUI textures and 3D text. We have a section dedicated to lighting, so we can add directional lights and point lights and spotlights and so on. And then we have our primitive 3D objects. And they're really simple, just cube, sphere, capsule, and so on. And then we have a list of kind of a random other selection of basic game object components. Now to get this project started, the first thing that I want to create is a cube. And when we generate the cube, it's just kind of sitting in this space. And I kind of lucked out because it actually created this object right in the center of my world. And I can tell because if I look over here at the transform component, so if I look in the inspector, I can see that it has a transform component, and the position of this cube when I created it was 0 along the X, 0 along the Y, and 0 along the Z. In other words, that was the origin of our 3D space. Now when we look at the Unity interface, we know that we're looking at a 3-axis system. I can see it here in the widget in the top right-hand corner. And if I look at my cube object, I can see that I have 3 axes or 3 arrows pointing in a couple of different directions. Now, if you don't see these axes, that's a pretty good indicator that you do not have the move tool selected. And so I'll just choose rotate and scale here for a minute, and you can see how these axes change. Get in the habit, if you're not already set to the move tool, it's the tool in the top left-hand corner just to the right of the hand tool, make sure that you have the move tool selected as your default tool. With the move tool selected, any object that you select, you'll see it'll give you the 3 direction axes. Now, each one of these axes represents a transform or a direction of that object in the world space. And so if I want to move this cube up and restrict it to an axis, I can just roll over one of these axes and click and drag and lift it up. Now you can see that no matter how sloppy my mouse is here, it's restricting that axis or restricting that movement along the up axis in this case. If I roll over the Z axis, I can drag that and restrict its movement. Now if I look over here in the right corner, and I'm looking in the inspector panel and I look at the transform, you can see that as I'm dragging this around, I can see the number of the axis or the position of the axis being influenced as I drag this around. Now, there's a couple of different ways to position, scale, and rotate content inside Unity. As you can see, I can grab the axes and click and drag and move that around. I can go to the transform component, find the position coordinates, and I can key in a value. So if I change this to 10, it jumps off screen. If I set it to 5, you can see that I've moved it along the x-axis. I'll delete that and set it to 0. I'll zero out the Y position and I'll zero out the Z position. So I know that that is in the center of my 3D space. Now there's another way to influence the transform component here. If I roll my mouse just over the tag of one of the coordinates or one of the components, so in this case if I roll my mouse over the X, you can see that my cursor changes and I get an arrow left and right. What I can do is I can drag left or drag right and I can reduce that value. So I can slide to reduce the value, or I can slide to the right to increase that value. So that's another way that I can control this. Okay, and I'll just zero out that value once again. I can do the same thing with the rotation. So I can just click and slide these values around, and I can cause that cube to rotate just a little bit. Now my preference, in order to position things, is always going to be to modify these parameters in the transform component. Now when I say component, what I'm looking at is if you look inside the inspector, whenever you have an object selected, I'll select the camera just to take a different look here. This camera has a transform component, it has a camera component, it has a GUI layer component, and so on. If I go back to my cube, I can see that I have a transform component, and that transform component is made up of position, scale, and rotation. When I come across this rule here in the inspector, that indicates an additional component that's been added to this object. So I have an object that has a transform component. It also has a cube mesh filter. It has a box collider, mesh renderer, and a material. Okay, and we can keep adding different components on this to make this object much more complex. So when I talk about a component, what I'm talking about is the contents of the inspector panel. In this case, I'm focusing on the transform, and when it comes to positioning content inside Unity, I can slide things around to kind of get them in the general position, but then once I get them roughly where I want them, I want to fine-tune and kind of dial in the values in the transform component. So I'm just going to zero out these values once again. An alternative to zeroing out the values, if I have different values in here, and I want to reduce all of those back to 0 or the default, I can just click on this little cog, this little settings drop down here, and I can choose to reset. Now when I reset that, it's going to zero out all those values. Looks like it left Z to 1, so I'll just zero that out. And that's just another quick way to get everything to reset. So now for this project, I want to experiment with a couple of different game objects, and I want to start to play with the physics component. But before I do that, I want to take this cube, and I want this cube to represent my ground plane. So I'm going to do a couple of different things to make this happen. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to scale this object. Now, I don't want to scale the object in all 3 axes. I want to scale it only along the X, the red axis, and the Z. So I want it to maintain its 1 unit height, and I want it to scale out along its X and its Z axis. Okay, and there's a couple of different ways I can do that, but I'm going to find the easiest way to do that is, again, just go back into the transform, go to scale, and type in a value in the X field. In this case, I'll make it 10, and I'll type in a value in the Z field. So I have this nice big kind of plane that I'm working with. Now I kind of feel like the Y value might be a little high, so instead of using 1, I'll use 0.5. So I'll reduce that. So we can work in the decimals here. Now, when we're talking about units inside Unity, 1 unit is 1 meter. Now that's going to become important when we start to deal with the physics engine, because scale has a lot to do with animation and physics. So just be aware that when you're making objects, so in the case of creating a game object, and I'll just create a cube, this cube has a scale of 1 along the X, Y, and Z. And 1, according to Unity, is 1 meter, so it's roughly about 3 feet. So if I wanted to make something that was about the size of, say, a person, I would scale this Y value up to 2. So this cube is about the size of a person inside my environment. Okay? Now it's going to become important when we're playing around with animations and physics, because it has to do with time and the amount, at the rate at which things travel through an environment. But we'll talk about that in future presentations. For now, get the hang of introducing simple cubes into Unity, play around with their transform values, and if you knock things out of whack, you can always reset them by going down to this little cog here and choosing to reset the value. Okay, and just remember, as you're orbiting around and navigating your scene space, in the event that you get lost, if your camera gets kind of turned around and you lose your scene, all you have to do is go back to the hierarchy manager and double click on one of the objects, and that will frame it to the current view. So I'll orbit back and I'll roll my mouse out, and so I can take a different look. So remember, Option click and drag to orbit. You can use the mouse wheel to zoom in, and Option command to pan around. So play with some of those features, introduce some simple cubes into the environment, make sure that you create a ground plane. Make sure that that ground plane is positioned at 0, 0, 0 according to the X, Y, and Z. And we'll catch up in the next presentation and look at some additional game objects.